In this section, we're going to emphasise the way in which the social context has changed and why what we call new learning is now an imperative. We've already discussed, and we'll be discussing again and again and again, the issue that diversity is becoming more part of our society rather than less. Diversity across a number of domains, so much so that the traditional uniformity that was part of learning doesn't any longer have the same power or sense of purpose. And it won't work effectively in order to educate people to their potential or enable them to be useful in society. We have to take on board and to really understand all learners in their difference, in their own sense of identity, in the languages that they bring, the orientations that they bring to learning. It will matter that these are accounted for and recognised and harnessed. So that's one part of the changing social context. And it's not a matter of affirmative action, it's just a matter of the reality of the classroom. People will be different and will want different ways of engaging with their learning. And of course, the other one which we emphasise in this program is technology. The tools for designing and delivering learning are expanding. The tools for making meaning are expanding. The traditional tools that we had, which were blackboards and chalk and textbooks, they'll all still be important, of course, but they're less and less significant in the design and delivery of learning. So we have to account for the affordances of new technology as part of what's changing in society, and not just for education, but for many other domains as well. Now, the other two dimensions that are changing for the social context of education and why we call it new learning is the globe is getting more interconnected. All learners have to be prepared to be actors across the local to the global. So globalisation will be also part of the way that we engage in education, the way we design education and the purposes of education. The local and the global are interconnected around work, interconnected around media and entertainment, interconnected around food and the environment. Globalisation is not something other. It will become central to our lives and has to feature in new learning. And finally, in terms of the changing context, we used to evaluate education or traditional education around something we called a test. And a test was kind of an arbitrary point at the end of some intervention. Now we talk about data. What's the evidence for a program? What's the evidence of transformation? How do we evaluate a program? How do we evaluate educators? How do we evaluate learners? New metrics are developing for knowing that the decisions we've made and the engagement that learners have been a part of has really made a difference in their lives. So those four things, diversity and technology, plus globalisation, plus data, new forms of data, are part of a significant change in the social context of learning.
What we're talking about in this series of videos, this idea of new learning, is the new as a response to dramatically changing social contexts. Now, of course, one thing you might say about the modern world, it's been changing all along for the last 200 years, 500 years. I mean, we live in a society which has been in constant self-transformation. But in a way, schools as an institution have stayed pretty consistent and pretty stable for the 150 odd years since mass institutionalised education was first implemented on a wide scale, first constructed and first implemented. But this is an interesting moment when I think schools are unusually facing the winds of change. The word that's often used, which is a kind of a cliche in a way, is this word disruptive. This is a moment of disruptive change. And certain institutions remain pretty stable through these changes, but arguably schools are facing a particularly rigorous set of changes which may affect them an awful lot. Some of the big challenges that schools are facing is Historically, schools were kind of one-size-fits-all education. So if you were disabled, if you weren't a speaker of the national language, you were sent off somewhere else. And the idea of a school was to have students as homogenous as possible, because what you were doing is you were presenting a single narrative, a single set of skills that were being taught and whatever. But we live in an era now when social diversity is recognised, when social diversity is valued. So there's a crisis of what I would call one-size-fits-all education, and a recognition that learners in many, many ways, in terms of their abilities and capacities, in terms of their cultural backgrounds, in terms of their interests, in terms of their identities, are very, very different. So there's a strong recognition of that, and that really destabilises these traditional one-size-fits-all versions of mass institutionalised education. The other thing, another force which is really upon us in a lot of ways, is all the forces of what we might call globalisation, the reality of the fact that the local is very connected to the rest of the world, be it the fact that our student populations are actually global because there's a lot of huge population movements that weren't there in the past, but also part of what we have to do with students is prepare those learners for a future in which they may be very, very mobile, where the global is very close by and where the domain of their action is not just a local domain. Another area of substantial disruption, substantial change is technology, where in education the very tools of our trade, the tools with which we communicate between teachers and learners with each other, but also the very tools with which we represent knowledge and communicate what we've learned are changing quite radically as well. So, although the traditional forms of media in schools, which was teacher lectures, textbooks, syllabus documents, all of those things, the form of those and the media of transmission are changing quite radically, and also the way in which students themselves represent their own knowledge and present their own knowledge about the world. That's changing. So technology is having a big impact on education as well. And finally, one last challenge is a kind of obsession we have at the moment with metrics. Everything needs to be measured. So we have more and more tests. We have teacher accountability, which is assessment of teacher effectiveness based on all kinds of metrics, including learner outcomes. So we have a kind of an auditing and accounting and managerialist obsession at the moment. So metrics has become a very big part of our conceptual universe as well. Of course, it has too. If I in my pocket have a phone which counts the number of steps I do every day, and if I have, we're in this world where we're drenched with data, and we have apps and all kinds of things which are synthesizing that data, we end up with a kind of a metrics obsession. The idea of I heard this nice phrase recently: the measured self. That we're all the time measuring everything that we do. Now that also means that this focus on quantitative analytics is something which is heavily influenced education. So these are just 3 or 4 significant changes which are changing the nature of the work of educators.